Well, hello, and welcome to Your Average Bear Gaming. So last week, I magnetized an Ironclad Dreadnaught. This week, I'm going to paint it up so it can join my Deathwatch army. But I'm going to do something a little bit different. I added some armor texture. Have you tried that? I did. Let's see how it turned out. Here is the star of today's show, our Ironclad Dreadnought. In this video, we are going to paint him up in the style of the Space Marines Deathwatch army, like most of my painting, or actually all of my painting videos thus far. That won't always be the case, as I'm getting close to the end of my Space Marines Deathwatch collection, but I still have a few bits and bobs that I need to finish up for that army before I can move on to something new and less monolithically black. So, I've in the previous video, I magnetized all the pieces, some of which, like the arms, completely unnecessary to magnetize, but I did it anyway because maybe you're curious about it. If you're interested in that, go check out the previous video. But yeah, so there's a couple of pieces that are magnetized, and while the magnetization process can be a little messy, once you put a coat of primer on it, like I have here, the Army Painter Uniform Gray, it doesn't look too shabby. Yeah, you can kind of see some shiny bits there for the magnets, but for the most part, they're hidden, and that's the way I like it. So in this episode, we are going to paint this guy. But before we do, I want to do something a little bit different. As is so often the case with trying new things, there's an element of risk here. So, here's what I want to do. See this guy? Tamiya Putty. I'm going to be using this guy to add a little bit of texture, that armor texture, to our chonky boy here. And so, I saw this in a video that a tank modeler that has a YouTube channel put up on how to add kind of realistic, old-timey armor texture to tanks. And well, you know, this is not a World War II tank, and this is a space coffin. I think it would look cool, particularly because this is the Ironclad Dreadnought, a name that evokes thick, heavy armor. But it's all smooth and, you know, whatevs. It's all smooth, and I think it could benefit from some armor texture. So that's the plan for this model, is for some of these surfaces, obviously not everywhere, like I would never mess with this front part of the coffin, but for flat panels like here on the shoulder, maybe the top of the hull, places where he's likely to get hit. Ooh, like here, for example, I want to add some texture. Now, I've never done this before, and I don't know if anyone out there in YouTube land that builds and paints and plays with Warhammer 40k has an interest in adding texture to your armor, but I thought it was a neat technique, and I want to see if it works. So, there's a decent chance that I'm going to fail, because this is the first time I've done it. I don't know if it works, but I'm going to give it a shot. And I'm going to give it a shot starting right here. So, for those of you who've seen other videos know that I don't usually glue my models until the end after everything is painted, or, you know, I'll kind of mix and match. Sometimes I'll glue some parts, and sometimes I'll leave it to the end. So I've done the same here. Some of these assemblies are glued, and others are not, kind of depending on whether I think they will interfere with, with the painting process. So I'm going to start right here. This is a bit from the Venerable Dreadnought. The Ironclad Dreadnought had a different kind of little knee pad, but I've kind of added some bits and bobs from my other model because I like the way it could look. So, the first step that this YouTuber recommended was to get a brush, a stiff bristle brush, and I don't have a stiff bristle brush, but I do have an old brush, this guy. And this is what I'll be using. Oops. This guy. This is what I'll be using to apply the paint. This is what I used to use to apply my, my base coats and anything that was going to be sloppy with. But it's seen better days, and I think it's time to retire it as one of my paint brushes. So I'm going to clean up this saddle soap or whatever this conditioner is, and I'm going to start adding a little bit of this thin cement that I've added some plastic to, and I'm going to start stippling it onto the surface. Let's see if this works. Honestly, I have no idea if this is going to work, so wish me luck. So what Mr. YouTuber there said is to take some of this glue, gonna just add it, let it set for just a sec, and then go back and do some dab, dab, dab. So it kind of looks like that, and I think that's kind of what I'm going for, but not entirely. That's all right. This is just the first pass. I'm going to do this again with some of that Tamiya putty, but I'm going to let it dry and see what it looks like as it dries. It strikes me that I probably should have not primed it until I did this. My bad. Well, we'll see what it looks like and go from there. So that's what it looks like. Let it dry for a sec. I'm just going to try it on this piece first, just to make sure that it kind of does what I'm hoping it'll do. And so far, it kind of, yeah, it's giving it some kind of texture. Should be interesting to paint, and it'll be different from anything else I've done. So, yeah, let's see. You'll notice that I did the kind of the outside. I didn't do the inside. That's because this is for me, it's a decorative element, and I don't want to kind of mess about with that. I do have a plan for that. It's going to be a touch-up at the end. So, yeah, let's let this dry. So it feels reasonably dry. The texture pattern is pretty subtle, but I'm about to kick it up a notch with this mixture right here. And it's just a diluted form of this Tamiya putty, basic type, and I'm going to thicken it up just a little bit. I'm trying to match the consistency that the YouTuber demonstrated. He didn't really say, you know, it's a 50-50 blend, but it's just a mixture of this Tamiya putty and some of that thin plastic glue I was working with before. I'll link the video if you're interested in checking it out. I don't know if this is the right consistency, but I'm going to give it a shot. So, I've made this blend. This is basically just an additional texture. So we use the glue in the first pass to give it texture. Now we're going to add this putty and glue mixture, and we're just going to stipple it kind of like so. The idea is to imitate kind of like rough looking steel. I mean, it's a little weird. I've never done anything quite like this before, but it might look cool. Might look like garbage also. So I'm reserving judgment until it's done. But I think I'm reasonably confident that this approach is going to do something interesting with the texture anyway. And that means that my Ironclad Dreadnaught is probably going to be pretty different from everyone else's. And that for me is kind of a win. So this is the basic idea. I'm going to do this to a bunch of this. Yeah, I found this YouTuber that I've linked below quite by accident. I think I was trying to find out how to make my own texture paint for bases. That kind of stuff can get pretty expensive, and I think I was looking around for a recipe or something like that. And I just happened to run across this video, and I don't do any tank modeling. Only modeling I do is 40K. Anyway, I don't know why I saw it, but when I did, I thought, ooh, this would be kind of cool. As a matter of fact, I think one of the commenters on this channel had mentioned something about texturing or something, and I think that's what kind of started taking me down that path. I'm not entirely sure, but whatever the case, I am so glad that that I started looking for this. It's a completely new thing, at least for me. Like, maybe you guys have seen this before, and I'm making much ado about nothing. But this is a new thing for me, adding texture to the models, and it's a bit of extra work, I'm not going to lie. I'd be knee-deep in the base coat right now if I wasn't doing this. But it's not that much extra work. I think it might be worth it, just for the novelty alone. But obviously, the end result will tell if it was worth all this effort or if I just ruined a perfectly good $50 model. It'll probably look okay, but I want it to look good, so we'll see. I should point out this process is pretty messy and the fumes are pretty thick. If you're going to attempt something like this, just keep that in mind. Be in a well-ventilated area, or be prepared to have a little buzz going on and maybe losing some of those brain cells that we probably need for other things. And obviously the brush that you're using for the stippling, it's you're not going to use it again unless you do this texture painting again. It might survive for that, and I don't know, maybe some cleaning will help make it useful for that. But just be aware that you're probably going to ruin a brush, so don't use an expensive one. Please don't use an expensive one. Use a cheapo brush, or one that is ready to give up its last ghost. Another thing I should mention is that I'm not doing this texture to every surface on the Dreadnought. I'm only adding it to those surfaces where if I were a tech priest, I would add more armor. So any big flat surfaces that might attract some extra rounds, I'm giving it this texture to make it look like there's more armor on those sides. So I'm mostly doing the shoulders, or at least bits of the shoulders where it's not delicate machinery, but like, hey, these are armor panels and they're gonna look like armor panels. So I'm adding it to that. Some of the knee pad stuff, I'm adding it there because that's where we would also include some armor, I think. And just a little part of the front hull, which is kind of weird, right? Because you'd figure the front of the hull is where you want the thickest armor. But there's not a whole lot of space for this texturing on the front of the model. It's mostly decorative up there, and it's fine. Our brave coffin rider here doesn't necessarily have to have armor in the front, because that's where all the fun stuff happens.
Hey, did you like the video? Why don't you give it a like and a subscribe? Yay!
There's what he looks like with the stippled on putty texture. I think it looks alright. I think it gets across what I was trying to do. It kind of looks like that, I don't know if it's rolled iron or rolled steel, but it's got that rough, tanky texture. And I was able to put a little bit on the front here, kind of right under, I don't know, this looks like reactive armor or something, or a missile launch system. I don't know what that is, but underneath there's a little bit of front facing, and there's a little bit on the, the crotchal area. He doesn't have family jewels, but, you don't want to mess with phantom pain. Importantly, I didn't add any here at the top, because the top is where these hunter-killer missiles are going to go, if they're equipped. And I didn't add any to the hunter-killer missiles either, because that's all like delicate electronics and stuff like that. That's not what I would armor necessarily, not like this. And so I'll show you a little close-up here of the shoulder. So it's not quite the gray that I primed it. It looks very metallic for some reason. So I'm hoping that the base coat is going to tone that down a little bit. So you'll see the contrast between the armored piece and the unarmored. I mean, it's still armored, but it's like ceramite as opposed to like rolled steel. I don't know. I think it's a neat contrast. But it's, none of this is important if it doesn't look good with paint on it. So that is the next step. Time to get our base on. For my base coat, I'm going to go with a glaze of black. It's something I've been doing quite a bit of recently, and I've liked how it looks on my models, but I've never done it with a vehicle. So I don't really know what it's going to look like, but I'm hoping it's going to look alright. I've also never based a model with any sort of texture on it, so this is going to be a first, but I expect it should be alright. Alright, so here's my progress so far. I've done the basing for a lot of these parts, and you can kind of see the armor texture, but it's very subtle, and I wish it was a little less subtle. Yeah, so that's kind of how it's looking. I do have a confession to make. As I was doing this, I based the entire model, and I was really unhappy with how it turned out because the base that I was using was too thick. So it was really black, and you couldn't see, I mean, you can see the details, but not a lot of the details. So what I'm talking about is, you see all the kind of the gray stuff here. You can see the piping, the circle, all the edges. They're pretty well defined. I haven't done the backside yet. And that's only possible because I went in with a pretty thin glaze of black. It's like 1 drop of black and 6, 7 drops of water. Mix them all together, and it's this very thin glaze. And it gives the appearance of black, but it doesn't overwhelm what's underneath. And you know, it leaves kind of the edges raised. I've been using that for models, and I've never tried it on a vehicle before, and I like the way it looks. So I actually had to go back and reprime everything and then try it again with a thinner version of the wash, and it's working pretty well. I'm pretty happy with these results. You'll see here how you can see all the details. It's not just this big hunk of black. So I kind of want to show you what that looks like. You've probably seen me do it in other models, in other videos, but you know, if you're not watching those, you're watching this one. So let me show you what I mean as a way of me persuading or attempting to persuade you to do it this way. So you'll see how it's a pretty thin coat. And I mean, it's not a ton of coverage, and particularly in here where all that tubing is. So you still want it to be black, but you also don't want to kill all those little details. So you see that? See if it'll do more of a close-up. So it's all in there. It's a little more shiny than it should be, but that's just because it's wet. But when this dries down, it's very nice. And I'm being very liberal with this glaze because it's pretty light, and I can always darken it up after the fact if I want. I just can't lighten it up if it's too thick, and I don't want to reprime this. The other benefit of doing it this way is that it's really quick. So I was kind of afraid of applying the base to this model. It's, you know, it's quite a bit bigger. There's a lot more surface area to cover with the base than you'd have to deal with like even an elite model, like say a Terminator or something like that. I thought it was going to take forever, but because this glaze is so light, it goes on super quickly. You don't have to be really clean because, you know, it's really thin. Now, you still want to be a little clean. Like, if there's a part that's going to have a bright color, yeah, don't base it in that. But see how quick this is? And because it's so light, you don't have to worry about your brush strokes. Like sometimes you'll leave a brush stroke on the flat surface or even a curved surface, and you can see the stroke, and it's kind of a pain. Because there's such a thin glaze, it doesn't really do any of that. And if you have a little too much on one panel and not enough on another panel, it's just a detail. It's just, you know, a manufacturing variance, which gives your model a lot of character. So, yeah, I'm really excited about how this is looking. It's going to make the detailing quite a bit easier. If you're doing a full-on black primer for your black vehicles, Space Marine vehicles, just consider this technique. Just try it. Just try it. I think you're going to love it. Here's another little tip. If you're going to paint this way, if you're going to do this glazing on your vehicles, you want to pay a little bit more attention to the consistency of your glaze. What I mean is, as you're using this, so you're scooping up a nice wet brush with this glaze, and it doesn't really go on evenly. So what I'm saying is, at least so far as I can tell, when you pick up some of this paint, it seems to be picking up a lot of the water rather than the paint. And I may be completely wrong about this. It just feels like as I use the paint, the pigment gets thicker, so it gets darker as I go along. And so for big models like this, where you're going to use a lot of base coat paint, it's going to make a big difference. You really don't want your paint to change saturation as you're painting. You want it to stay consistent for the most part. So what I've been having to do is, every time I go back to load my brush, or every other time, I make sure to just give it a spin. I kind of slosh it around in a little puddle of paint, and that mixes it up so that it's always, roughly the same saturation with every brushful. It's part of what happened to me with this first attempt at this model that I had to scrap and try again. Was I had some variable consistency, and so as I used up the glaze that was too thin to begin with, I mean, there was no ifs, ands, or buts about that. But as I was using it, it was getting darker and darker, and I didn't really notice until I got to the end, and I thought, no, this is unsatisfactory. So, if you're going to use glazes, make sure that you stir them up as you're using them to keep the color consistent, or at least reasonably consistent. Alright, here's my Dreadnought. Nice and based. Everything that is associated with the Dreadnought is based. So I just went with the usual black and the red accent for the weapons, and just a few touches here and there. And I think it was worth repriming and revisiting with a thinner color of black, because there's a lot more detail showing up all over the model. So, like I said before, I hadn't done this approach before, and I'm happy to use it here. You can kind of see some of the texturing over the basing. Again, I think next time I'm going to be a bit more aggressive with it, because it just kind of looks... I mean, it looks slightly different, but it doesn't have a lot of the... I was hoping for more, like, higher texture so that it could kind of pool, some of the basing color could pool. I don't know. So, that's something to see for the next project, but... the step that follows this is to start adding some of the detail color, and I'm kind of split between using the silver as per usual or using gray as opposed to silver. It's one of the things that I've been thinking about, and maybe I'll do that here. As I'll go with gray as opposed to silver. I don't know, because that shoulder pad, I like the silver. I don't know, I'll start filling in some of the, for sure, metal pieces, like the weapon muzzles and stuff like that. I'm not sure what I'm going to do with this piece. I'm playing with the idea of a couple of different colors, but we'll see. Here I'm also playing with something different. I usually do gold, and I'm thinking about doing like a bone color. So, yeah, I'm just going to start doing some of those details. I'll probably start with the arms, because those are pretty straightforward. Yeah. Alright, so I finished kind of refining the base, and here's where I'm at. Still looks a little rough, but it's kind of taking shape. Aside from the basic red and silver accents, I went ahead and added a little bit of bone white color to the, I don't know what these are. Maybe it's like reactive armor or what have you. I need to do the same thing with the wings. I usually do that in gold, but I feel like there's still already too much metallic on this guy, so I did something a little different. I know it doesn't look too bad. I'm not sure how I feel about it. I also gave him a little matching detail here on the pauldron, not the pauldron, the shin guard, I guess, on him. And so also kind of got the missiles sort of set. At least, you know, they have the white. I think I'm going to add a red element to that, but I'm not quite sure what to do without making it look too cartoony. They're already pretty cartoony because they're humongous missiles. They're way out of proportion. I know that's the Games Workshop style, but it looks odd, man. And so one of the things I would probably recommend before you paint one of these yourself is before you assemble this arm. So obviously I've magnetized. So as you're magnetizing, you have to put pieces together, and this is one of those pieces that you have to put together. And so the magnet goes in there, but this guy needs to be glued. So there's like two halves that have to be glued together. Before you glue this, I highly recommend that you paint this guy, because there's a couple of spots in here that are really hard to get to. So it's not just on this weapon, but also on the inside of this clamp thing. So if you want to do a really good job painting, you know, don't assemble this, don't glue this in until you're, you know, finished painting this guy. I don't know if you can tell. Let me see. If I adjust my lighting a bit, you might be able to see. Well, I don't think you can see, but kind of the inside of that is gray. I can kind of, yeah, there it is. It's gray, and it's really tight to get a brush in there. So I'm left with a couple of options. I can kind of split this apart and go in there. I think I'm going to just let it be. Let it be, let it be. So there's where he's at. I have two things to do, well, three things to do. One of them is to kind of glue down what's going to be glued down. And honestly, there's not much that has to be glued down at this point. There's the backpack, the power plant, there's the shin guards, and the smoke launchers. That's it. Everything else is magnetized. So I'm going to glue those pieces on. I'm not quite decided yet how I'm going to mount them to this base. I've kind of done some painting on it, but I was kind of hoping to do like having him stepping on something. I don't know if that's going to be possible. I'll have to kind of look around my bits boxes to see if there's anything that I have and it doesn't make him look goofy, like, you know what I mean? Like he looks like he's, because when he's stepping on it, he doesn't have any hip. Well, he does have some hip articulation. Maybe I can pull this off. I'll play around with it to see if I can make it look like he's stepping on something. But other than that, I'm going to do, once I do the gluing, I'm going to start adding some of the washes. So in some of these areas, like the red weapons, I'm going to use some black wash, or maybe some other kind of wash. I haven't decided yet. Here, I really want to highlight the fact that these are individual squares, so I'll probably go in with a black wash in here to kind of define them. And then just adding little tiny details like, I don't know, like windows, not windows, like glass elements, if there's any glass elements on this, and things like that. So I'm at the end of this. I'm really close to the end, which is weird. It's been both kind of fast and slow. So anyway, I'm going to give this a shot, yo. Did I give you a look at the Hurricane Bolter? The difference a little bit of wash can do. This is just normal black wash. And I'm going to allow it to pool in certain recesses. And kind of give it a general layer across the weapon system. And on the belts feeding the ammunition in there. Makes quite a bit of difference from this guy. And it's much faster and way easier than adding each of these little lines here by hand. It can be done, but it takes longer, and at the end I don't know that the difference in the appearance justifies the amount of time you spend filling in those dots, those pieces, those parts. So with the wash, you get it all looking pretty good pretty quickly. It does change the ultimate color of your weapon quite a bit, I won't lie, but I think it gives it a bit more character. This pure red that I've used, I don't know, I've gotten bored with the way it looks. I used to thought it was really vibrant and neat. Now I'm just kind of like, I'm done painting with it. But I'm not, because it's a color scheme I chose. So, having that black wash really helps tone it down while doing a considerable amount of work towards the overall appearance of the final model. Do the same thing anywhere there's like tubing, just so that it falls into the recesses. And little like grate systems like this enhances the darkness inside the actual gates, or the grate. When it dries, it won't be quite as dramatic, but it helps. Same thing with this here. The weapon has a lot of little details, well, not a lot, but it has some details in there that otherwise would be kind of swamped by just the overall redness. And then when I first load up my brush, I want to make sure it's loaded nice and heavy, but I don't usually want to have that much of the wash on there, so I deposit it somewhere, and since it's pretty wet, I can go back and pick it up later. I mean, not a lot later. As soon as if it dries, it's pretty much done. But if I'm working like this with a bunch of pieces, you have time to go back to your original deposit and, you know, soaking it up with your brush. Here, I'll give you another example of this seismic hammer. That's what it looks like. I'll let you wash. It's pretty, I mean, you know, it's metal color, whatevs. But I think it looks pretty blah. Here's what happens when I add a little bit of black wash over the metal drill parts. And so there's the same weapon with the black wash. Now it's going to dry, and so it's going to look different when it dries. But I've even been able to, since I use a pretty wet brush for this, I pull it kind of in these really deep crevices, and so it gives it a nice gradient effect when it dries. So that's one of the nice things about using a washing technique like this, is that you can play with the density of the wash way easier than you could, say, do a wet blend. So it's kind of like doing a wet blend, just not anywhere as hard, or, you know, with as good results, honestly. But it's kind of that. And so you might be asking yourself, George, you talk about this all the time, like literally every painting video. Why are you still talking about it? Well, A, I don't have a ton of repeat viewers. I have I have a few, and I really appreciate those that do watch my videos, pretty regularly. But most of the people who find me because they have a specific project in mind and they want a few ideas. And that's cool, and I love those people too. So, chances are, someone who's watching this hasn't seen any of my other videos and doesn't know about washing. And I've seen a couple of images on Reddit. Most of those on the 40K and the Deathwatch pages, or Reddit pages, I guess. They're incredible. Way better than anything I could ever do. Those guys are amazing, fantastic. But there's a number of people who post images, and it's clear that they're new. And I'm super glad that they're trying the hobby. It can be a wonderful thing, a wonderful way of spending your time. However, when you're new, you probably don't know about some of these techniques, like using washes and dry brushing and blending, etc., etc., watering down your paints. So I've seen a couple of posts from people who look like they've kind of just started. They could really benefit from thinning down their paints, using some basic washing and dry brushing, stuff like that. So that's who this message is for. If you already know about washing and you're saying, George, duh, everyone knows, cool. That's awesome. I'm glad you do, and I hope it pays dividends for you as it does for me. But if you don't know about washing, it makes a huge difference. I thought I was done, but I don't think I am. So I'm taking a look at what he looks like, and he looks fine-ish, but he's a little flat, I don't know, there's a touch of something missing, and I'm afraid that my paint job, even though I used a glaze, maybe it's a little darker there or a little thicker. I'm not sure what it is, but it didn't turn out quite the way I was hoping. So I'm going to have to, I think, add some additional something. And that additional something, I believe it's going to end up having to be some edge highlighting. Because that's just the way painting goes. You have a plan, and it seems to, be a good plan. But they don't always turn out the way you want, and so you got to learn how to adapt. So that's precisely what I'm going to do here. I think some edge highlighting is going to bring a little bit of life to this otherwise pretty bland model. I'm going to start with a different color. So I want to do a two-part highlight, or two-part edge highlight, I think. And now I don't. Well, you know what? Let's give it a shot. Let's not give up right away. You know what? No. It's just not going to work. This color doesn't really show up almost at all. So I'm going to have to try something else. So I'm wiping off the paint I've applied with the help of this little cosmetic sponge. Since I'm wiping off wet paint off of paint that's already dried, it shouldn't pull off too much of the underlying paint. Should be alright. I don't know what this is going to look like either, so this experiment might not work the way I'm hoping. Let's find out if my little mix is going to work. Yeah, okay. Yeah, this can work. It's pretty subtle, but you can see it. So yeah, I'll spend some time adding the highlights. Maybe not every single angle, but many of the larger ones. So here's the Dreadnought hull with the very first round of edge highlighting. It's pretty subtle. It's a darker gray, so it looks a lot like the black. You can kind of see there, and there's a little bit of it too on the arms. Again, it's fairly subtle. Some places it's a little more noticeable than others. And that's okay, because that wasn't the final appearance of this thing. I always intended to do another round with a lighter shade of gray. The hopes that I have both of the colors showing up sometimes. Well, at long last, our Stompy buddy here is complete. It took me a while longer than I expected. I think there was a lot of rework to do. Obviously, the magnetization always adds, 7.5 months to the build. Okay, so maybe not that much. But yeah, I tried a couple of different things with this model, and not that they didn't work necessarily, but they didn't work as well as I would hope, and it did add to the build time, and I had to do some rework. So, I mean, overall, I think it's a decent looking model. I got a little sloppy with the kind of the optics and stuff like that. After working on this model for a while, just kind of wanted to be done with it, which is, it's always a danger, right, with a larger project like this. But I'm pretty happy with the way he turned out. I mean, he's magnetized. I can swap the arms. I can, add and remove the missile pods, even the accessory weapons underslung on the combat arms. And I even managed to get a decent looking pose on the base. Our boy here is stomping on an old skull from who knows what kind of Xenos scum. So he deserves a little stomping. The thing that I tried that was the most different was the armor texturing. And it didn't turn out the way I had hoped. I mean, you can kind of see a difference, but it's not very pronounced. And I think for this effect to really do the job, it has to be more pronounced. But this was a first attempt, and this is why one of the things that we experience and when we do experiments is that we learn something, right? So I have an idea of what I want to try next time, but this is really the kind of thing that you only want to try on, say, like vehicles, like dreadnoughts, or maybe like a heavy tank. Maybe if I perfect the technique, if I ever start doing the Imperial Guard units, then yeah, maybe I'll try that more often on those models. So overall, I think it looks neat. He did end up having to require the edge highlighting to make it kind of pop a little bit. It was pretty flat looking, even with the using the glaze as a base coat. So I'll have to kind of experiment with that some more. I'm sure I have plenty of models with which to continue my learning process. So I hope you enjoyed some of this. And if you try the texture technique that I tried here and have better success, why don't you leave me a note? Let me know how it went. Tell me whether you succeeded. Did you do something different than I did? That'd be kind of cool to learn a little bit from those of you who are working on this back at home. So anyway, thank you again for watching, I appreciate your support, and I hope you have a wonderful day.